Good morning. Welcome back to Sage and Stone Homestead. My name is Heather. I think we ended the last garden tour with me shutting the greenhouse, and now we've started this garden tour with me opening the greenhouse. It turns out that we had decently severe weather the past 2 weekends, and that doesn't normally happen, but it happened. So I'm not sure if my microphone is picking it up, but the greenhouse is just buzzing with life this morning. I think a lot of those cute little squash bees, I don't know if you've seen them, I think a lot of them slept in the squash flowers overnight, as they do, and they're pollinating quite well this morning. I can hear them. Trying to grow squash every year that I've had a garden. So we started gardening here in 2019, so this is our 5th garden season, and this is the first time I have ever gotten a squash plant, a bush variety squash plant, to be this big and this healthy. Actually, I gave it what I assumed was going to be, you know, enough space about every 2 feet and, you know, 1 row of the garden. Well, this here is actually 2 different scallop squash plants, and it seems like the 2-foot spacing this way is pretty good, but it has absolutely taken over not just 1 row, but this 2nd row here. Which, based on past experience for me and squash in the garden, my plants never would have gotten this big before the bugs just would have overtaken and the plant would have been dead way before it was this big. So that's what I expected, but that's not what happened, which I am really grateful for. But when I have been succession sowing my squash, I haven't been really thinking this big. So behind these purple hulled pink-eyed peas that I did put a trellis on this week, I do have more of these scallop squash. See, there's actually a baby one right there. So there's a high likelihood that it's going to get real crowded back here, but I guess it happens. Actually, I had thought that I planted all of this sugar ready squash all in here, but it was recently when I saw the little fruit coming on that I knew what these were. I can hear the bees over here too. Good morning. So this is what we've got going on in here. This is a bush style sugar ready squash, or like, it's kind of like a spaghetti squash, but it's a hybrid. I have been told that that is actually a vining variety and it's gonna go kind of crazy. So far so good. It hasn't gone super crazy, so I don't know. That's what the reviews said though. On the other side of the black-eyed peas here, I had planted some more squash. I'm guessing that these are bush style sugar ready. I haven't really labeled anything in the garden this year. And I think that is what this is as well. I had thought maybe I had shoved a bush style watermelon on this side, but these are not watermelon blossoms. I have plans for this garden year to make it quite the bean year. And so I have several different varieties of beans. I know in here I've got dragon tongue bush beans. I had a couple different spots where the beans just didn't germinate in this center row here. So I had it in me to plant a little bit of okra. And this is going to get very, very tall, so it should be quite the interesting little feature here in the greenhouse. There's an okra here too, and I had planted okra here as well, but I had old seed and it didn't germinate, so I've stuck some flowers in here. That was just a couple days ago, so they're not up yet. But we're starting to get some flowers on these bush beans here, and the black-eyed peas have been flowering for some time. So we've got a few little tiny peas coming on. These ones are a little bit bigger. See that? You can harvest these field peas as really small and tender and use them kind of like green beans. We're planning on letting these get real big and dry out because we plan to use these for shelling peas. One last little tidbit about the squash and then we'll go ahead to the lane and the raised bed garden. But yesterday our feels like temperature in southwestern Kentucky was 103 degrees. And we do have ventilation systems and fans and things in the greenhouse, but it doesn't matter. If it's 103 outside, it's going to be at least 103 inside, sometimes more, because it is hard for the breeze to really get through here super well. I came in the greenhouse yesterday checking on things, and ordinarily, my squash plants would just be ultra wilted. That can happen in the heat, and it can also be normal. They have those really big leaves, and oftentimes to kind of conserve their water, they'll almost deplete their leaves of that, and then you'll see them come right back to life when it cools down in the evening. But all of these squash plants in here were absolutely full and not wilted at all. And my theory is, I know that humidity is very good for plants. Humidity can actually get plants through the heat better than like a dry heat. And inside this greenhouse, it retains a ton of humidity. And I feel like it's been about 100% humidity outside. I don't think, oh yeah, it does. My little temperature thing over here tells us at the moment it's 83% humidity, but I don't know if you can see the little down arrow. That is down from what it has been. So it's been more humid than that in the greenhouse, and that helps protect the plants. Us humans, mammals, things like that, the humidity almost makes the heat worse, but for whatever reason that I can't exactly explain, it helps pull plants through heat stress. I'll have to come back for these. Didn't bring my basket. So up here in the lane, things are going very well. I noticed that some things are starting to flower. See? This is one of the cucumbers that I planted, and we should be seeing cucumbers next week for sure. It looks like I may have planted a bush style variety of something right here. I have no idea what this is. Again, I didn't mark things very well, but that's interesting. This probably won't climb. It doesn't look like it. It's already starting to put on little flowers. This looks like a bush style squash. And we're just gonna have to wait to see what it is. It might be more of that sugaretti. I had issues with germination earlier in the year, and I was just putting seeds in the ground just to get anything to germinate, and we have a really full lane now. Some of the melons up here are starting to flower as well. And then look at these. This is the Tromboncino squash, and at the moment it is probably taller than me. It's as tall as me. By the end of today, this is going to be taller than me. And what's gonna happen is just gonna kind of flap over and kind of continue growing up along this trellis. This is going to be possibly a tangled mess at the end of the year as far as all of these plants that we have growing on here, but I still think it's gonna be pretty epic. See that? Oh, we might have missed it. I saw a squash vine borer over here. So I don't think I got it on camera, but there was a squash vine borer moth over here on what I think is a standard size spaghetti squash. I haven't seen barely any bugs on these plants, but we're due. It's the middle of June, end of June. Yeah, the end of June. So we're due for dealing with some bugs. That's the worst bug that I think we deal with on our farm, because they lay this little tiny copper egg that turns into a very destructive like grub that will actually tunnel in the vine of this plant and cut off its water supply and kill it. So usually when you're looking for squash vine borer eggs, you want to look kind of towards the base of the plant, and like I said, they're really tiny and copper colored. I can't believe we actually found some, but look, that's it. And if we just pick these off, it should help. There we go. I had always thought that squash vine borers and other squash bugs and things were drawn to the squash plants by their blooms. This particular plant is not blooming, so maybe that's not the case. I don't know how they find their thing that they attack, but they're real good at it. What I'm likely going to do today, probably in the evening time, is I've got some BT. It's called Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a kind of bacterium that is essentially toxic to larval forms of anything. And what I'm going to do is spray that targeted towards the vine of the plants, and that should help protect them. Now when it rains or when we get a heavy dew, I'm gonna have to reapply, but if I don't do it, I'm gonna probably lose that plant. It's just part of the history of me and squash. It's part of the reason that I planted this lane so heavily, because I knew there were gonna be a few losses, and the vines that did survive, like the melons, that Tromboncino will probably be fine. Those will fill in the gaps. I have been coming along and kind of coaxing these vines to do their thing. Now they are making these little tendrils and they are attaching to the trellis pretty well, but they still need a little bit of encouragement to grow vertically instead of along the ground. Over here in the raised bed garden, the arched trellis is very, very quickly turning into a nice little shady oasis because of this birdhouse gourd right here. This is one plant right here. I did notice that another plant that I had put in the ground, just in case this one didn't come up, that has also germinated. It's actually way down here. It's getting pretty shaded out by that gourd and these beautiful large sunflowers, which I don't think opened up yet. So I guess I'll leave it and see what it does. It might pick up steam once these sunflowers come out. But coming back to the beginning here, I don't know if you guys have ever rescued a plant from the dead and dying section at the hardware store, but I did that with this little mini knockout rose, and look at her. She's doing well. My volunteer tomato that's in here on the arch trellis is doing lovely. I believe this is a Belgian giant. It's a super healthy plant. Look how thick this stalk is. On the other side of the birdhouse gourd is a loofah gourd, and this gourd isn't as, I don't know, it doesn't stretch out as much as the birdhouse gourd seems to. So I have a couple of these on the trellis. There's this one here that has two little main leaders on it, and then I've got one over here, and this is getting pretty tall as well. They don't seem as persistent as the birdhouse gourd, but they're definitely underway. Speaking about birdhouse gourd, here's another one. I had planted a whole bunch of these, really expecting, like I expect out of gourds from me basically every year, I expected them to die, but it seems like these gourds, the birdhouse gourd and the loofah gourd, are pretty resistant to the squash vine borer. And I really hope that remains to be true, because I am kind of attached to these guys at this point. I have visions of hanging squash in not very long. This one is actually a little bit wilted, but I noticed that one of the male flowers was open yesterday. And unlike a lot of squash varieties, this is a really pretty white flower. Stepping into the jungle, our corn, this is peaches and cream corn, has started to put out its tassels. So this is the pollination part of the plant, and we've actually chosen to plant our corn in blocks this year. You can, and we have planted them in rows before. Putting them in blocks like this kind of keeps them a little bit more snugged together. If you plant corn a little bit too far apart, the pollination won't be complete, and that's when you'll get those corn ears with kind of gaps in their rows of kernels. Notice that the blackberries are starting to do their thing. So this berry, it was kind of shiny for a couple days, and now it's started to get a little bit dull. It's lost that initial sheen, and this is the ideal time to pick. The sugars at this point in the berry are very well developed and super yummy. Can confirm. The one next to it, it still has a little bit of red in it too, but I don't know if it's going to come up on camera, but it's pretty shiny. It's going to be not as sweet. It's hard to tell, but there's a whole bunch of berries in this jungle. Even though we have to dig for them, it's kind of nice that they're buried. I feel like it's going to help protect them from the birds. And this blackberry plant here, this few blackberry plants that we have over here, they are thornless, and so we can dig all in there and not get all torn up. Our peppers have started to flower, and I haven't really been poking around in here too much. Aha! First little peppers doing their thing. So close. So over here in the nightshade beds, I've noticed that our eggplant is flowering. So it looks like this may be starting to recover from its very severe flea beetle damage. See, the newer leaves don't have as much damage, so this is probably gonna pull through. I would bet the fact that these plants are somewhat shaded during the day is helping them with the stress. I totally might be wrong here, but I feel like dealing with multiple stresses like bug and heavy sun probably wouldn't be good for a plant that's kind of suffering. And thank you so much to the person who went back into last year's garden tours and confirmed with me that this was in fact purple. And I had the same question last year that I did this year. I thought that this should have been red. Red blossoms is what I expected this year as well as last year apparently. But next year I'm gonna remember. This is purple. Part of the reason I'm gonna remember is because I'm gonna actually be harvesting and doing things with it this year. So I plan to actually harvest these and use our freeze dryer to preserve these to make teas and salves. I need to really get out here probably sometime today and harvest these because there's lots. They look like they're good and ready. So just like the squash plants, the tomato plants in the raised bed garden are just about as tall as me, and these guys are also going to get to the tippy top of this trellis and then beyond. And they'll do essentially the same thing that the squash does. They just don't have those tendrils to like grab on and really climb, but they'll kind of flop over, and they have at least 6 feet here to climb, and they'd go 8, 10 feet if you let them. Now these here are indeterminate tomatoes, and I have been pruning them like an indeterminate tomato should be. I guess it's kind of just dependent on where you are. As I mentioned, our humidity is insane. It's absolutely insane, not just in the greenhouse, but in general. And in order to keep tomatoes healthy in our area, we really need to prune them so we can get the most out of them. So I have been pruning these, and I haven't brought you along to show you how I prune, but I did leave this one here on the end so we can talk about it. So as I mentioned, the tomatoes that I'm growing here in the raised bed garden are all indeterminate tomatoes. And that means that they're gonna grow to an indeterminate size. And as long as you feed them well, they'll produce an indeterminate amount of fruit. Just kind of depends on how long they live and how long your season is. And really their genetics and how many fruits that they tend to put on each truss. So this plant got a little bit out of hand. We had some rain this past week and the garden really loved it. A lot of things grew by several inches a day, and this tomato was really no exception. Now I did tie up one time on this tomato, so it's not completely laying down on the ground, but with a lot of tomato plants, that's really their downfall, is crawling around on the ground. Keeps them really close to moisture and the bacteria in the soil, and it can cause a lot of disease. So we want to trellis this plant up so that we can prolong its life as long as possible and thus get as much fruit as possible. So I will also be pruning off what are called suckers, and I think it's pretty obvious right here. So we have this large main stem part of the plant, and then in the leaf node of this plant is essentially an entire new plant growing. And what I'm going to do here is actually take this little sucker and snap it right off. Here is our sucker, and if we wanted to, we could actually root this in water and grow an entire new tomato plant out of it that would in and of itself be an indeterminate tomato. They're just infinitely productive, these guys. But the reason that I want to pull these off is these are going to be taking the energy out of the plant that it could be into producing its fruit, and it also kind of contributes into kind of a congested growth pattern that doesn't allow for a lot of airflow. So here I've got another sucker. This one is actually kind of big, so if I follow along the main stem here with my eyes, I can see that this here is the main stem, this here is a leaf, and in this leaf node is the sucker. It's kind of big, so I'm going to use my little scissors here to snap this off. This one will be a great candidate for rooting in water. See all these little hairs on this sucker? Each one of these hairs has the potential to be a root. And if you let the tomato grow along the ground like they kind of like to, each one of these hairs that touches the ground, it will be a root, and they will grow those roots all along the vine. So probably about every 7 to 10 days I'll come through the garden and look at each plant. Well, I mean, I come through way more often than that, but I come through the garden with the intention of pruning about every week to 10 days. And when I do that, I'm not only pruning off the suckers. What I'm gonna do is actually prune off some of the bottom leaves. Now this one isn't diseased, but it's closer towards the bottom, about the bottom 18 to 24 inches eventually will have no leaves, and that's gonna again help keep the plant dry. It's gonna prevent splashback from the rain hitting the garden bed and splashing water back up on the leaves. It's just gonna help keep them much more healthy. And I mentioned before about looking for the main stem of your plant. So some of them will try, if you kind of miss the initial little suckers, they'll try to grow into more than one main stem. And we have that situation going on here. A lot of people will prune down their plants to where they only have one main growth point, and that's really where they want to keep it. I will let mine go to 2 or 3 main growth points, and that kind of depends again on your humidity and how much airflow that you need to give your plants, but also it depends on how far apart you've planted them. Because if you try to make a plant produce a lot that's planted really close to another plant, you're just not going to get the result that you want out of it, and they're probably going to get choked out for nutrition and as well as airflow. So this plant is actually a 2-liter plant. Down at the base it looks like a little Y, and I have one of these kind of guided up towards the trellis, and then we have this little guy that we need to take care of. So there's a couple different ways that you can trellis up or tie up your tomatoes, but I run out of my normal tomato tie, and I have this braided elastic that I have from my days as a seamstress, and so I'm using that. You really want to use something that's going to have some give, as we saw on the tomato plant in the arch trellis that's really, really fat. These are going to grow upward, of course, but they are also going to get like thicker in response to, you know, the wind and things, and we want to allow the plant to be able to have that expansion. And also you want it to be able to move a little bit with the wind so it doesn't snap off. So here we have our 2 main leaders. One of them is pretty much already laying against the trellis, and it's easy to tell where I'm gonna be able to tie that. This one I'm gonna try to put over here. Now, I am gonna have to twist the plant a little bit, and I don't wanna twist it too hard because you can snap them off, and obviously that is not the point. So I'm just gonna try to be gentle and coax this guy over here. It's good. So I don't wanna be tying super tight, but I do want it to essentially not move. I want it to be able to grow up along this trellis. And right now it is looking kind of, it looks like I forced it over. But as the hours go by during the day, these leaves are going to correct themselves and the plant will grow up towards the sun. I have pruned off leaves of the plants before that were higher up than the 18 and 24 inches that are closer towards the bottom, just to help promote airflow. I don't really see that I have to do that today, but you can do that. You just want to leave a good amount of leaves on there. It's kind of hard to quantify, but use your gut. Just be smart. They need their leaves to collect sun and to get nutrition for the plant, and they also need their leaves to help shade the fruit. So I had mentioned that I let my plants go to about 2, maybe 3 main leaders on the indeterminate tomatoes that I grow. Sometimes cherry varieties have a mind of their own, and they put a ton of suckers on, and it's kind of impossible to stay on top of them. Those I will absolutely still prune, but those get a little bit more leeway and they're allowed to go a little bit more wild. They tend to be a little bit healthier, so they can stay a little bit more compact and not be impacted by too much disease. So over here I do have a couple different cherry tomato varieties, and I have noticed that we are getting some ripe fruit. So this is actually not my first ripe tomato that I've had this year. This is my 3rd, but there it is. These are very often the first tomatoes to become ripe for us in our garden, the cherry type tomatoes. And this is a spoon type tomato. It's actually smaller than your standard cherry. This is not the smallest that they come, but this is one that volunteers on our farm every year. I did not plant this intentionally. It just kind of grew, and I did move it to the garden. And they are so good. A lot of yellow tomatoes kind of lack in flavor. They're not the most impressive tomatoes, but I find that the yellow currant tomato, that's what this is, has a lot of really great umami flavor. And that's really what I'm looking for in a good tomato, that umami, yummy flavor. So hard to describe, but I think a lot of you know what I'm talking about. So back here on the back end of the garden, things are looking a little wild, but this is what this patch should look like this time of year. These are actually our asparagus. So we collected or harvested a lot of asparagus this year. But it's really important that we leave some of the asparagus behind, a lot of the asparagus behind, in order to do this. This is what asparagus looks like when it matures and fronds out, and it's gonna collect the sun all throughout the year and use that energy to feed the crown and allow us to get a lot more asparagus next year. You can actually kind of weasel in here and see something that resembles an asparagus. That's because it is, but that's gonna look just like this in no time flat. And fun fact that you might not have known, asparagus plants actually come in male and female. And the way that you'll tell what you've got is the male fronds, as far as I know, don't really produce anything discernible on their frond leaves here, but the females will produce flowers. They're little tiny bell-shaped flowers. So these are the cute little flowers right here. The pollinators do really enjoy them. And once they're pollinated, they put on these berries, and the berries will eventually turn red, and the seed inside the berries will turn black when it's mature, but the berries are toxic, so don't allow anybody to eat asparagus berries. Because there's so many of them, a lot of them get eaten by birds and get spread around. Inevitably, they will fall and create more asparagus plants. Look what we have here. This is probably one of those spoon tomatoes. And it looks like there's probably space for it to grow, so I guess we'll let it. It is pretty shaded down here. It's probably gonna get plenty of afternoon sun. That's funny. These things that look kind of like the asparagus seeds or little berries are actually not. This is cilantro, or it was. I guess it still is, but the seeds that are left, when they dry out, we'll be able to harvest them because they are the coriander spice. And cilantro plants really like to flower and go to seed, so we get a lot of coriander every year. There's coriander in one of my pickling recipes, and I've heard of coriander bread, which I have yet to do, but clearly I need to. If you have any other coriander recipes, I will gladly hear them. So the kids' garden over here is looking kind of wild. They really haven't been coming in here and weeding. I have been coming in here to trellis up their tomatoes because these guys, oh my goodness, to ignore these would just be a sin. These are absolutely ginormous. I think that these are also Belgian giants, but I feel like the ones in my garden are paling in comparison to the ones that the kids are growing by accident here. Well, it wasn't an accident. I mean, they intentionally put these plants here, but they found volunteer plants to stick in their garden. A few of these volunteers are actually Tigerella type tomatoes, and I've noticed that they are starting to get a little bit of give when you squeeze them. The Tigerellas that we've planted in the past are mostly green even when they are ripe, and a way that you can tell a green tomato is ripe or ripening is by their firmness. So I've been coming through and kind of squeezing them, and I can tell that we're getting close. It's going to be the fruits that are lower towards the bottom that are going to mature the fastest because they're the ones that got set first. See how this one's starting to blush on the bottom? I'm trying to be real gentle and not break it off prematurely. Truthfully, if this one did break off because it's started to ripen, it would ripen fine indoors. But they just taste better when you let them ripen out here on the vine in the sun. Their watermelon is absolutely taking over. Look at this. Probably can't walk through here very well. I haven't even looked to see if we've got any fruit setting in here. You can hear the bees. There have been plenty of bees in there, so I know that there's going to be fruit, and pretty soon they won't be hard to find. They're going to be pretty big. Calamity. Good morning, sweetie. How are you? You ready to be milked? Look at that udder. So I did do a morning garden tour, which is a little bit out of the ordinary for me because I do normally milk my girls in the morning. These girls are good and ready. I'm probably only about a half an hour late, so it's not too bad. You ready? Ever since she was a baby, she hates being kissed.